Joined by former National Security Advisor of the United States, John Bolton. Let's go straight across to him, Mr. Bolton. Thank you very much for speaking to Times Now. India has just handed over the presidency of the G20 summit. President Biden, Prime Minister Modi, the bilateral meeting has happened. Are you surprised about the decision of Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping to not attend? First up.
Well, I think from the perspective of Russia and China, it's a big mistake. This is, I can tell you from having been in India earlier this year, I know the extent of the preparations that the government and people have made for the G20, and for those two leaders not to show up really is a kind of disrespect for the prime minister and for India. And it's perhaps understandable in Putin's case. He didn't want to be surrounded by a lot of critics of his invasion of Ukraine. But for Xi Jinping not to show, I just it's inexcusable, and it's a mistake, and I think it will cost them. It undercuts the possibility of having more meaningful discussions at the G20. But I think it's very important from the perspective of India and the United States that the Prime Minister and President Biden are having a chance to talk.
Mr. Bolton, what do you think actually Mr. Putin would have been expecting? So far, the reactions that we've got from Russia, they think that when it comes to the Delhi Declaration, they have managed to score a major win. Do you think it's up to the expectations?
Well, I think that the outcome of the summit itself obviously will be affected by the absence of Putin and Xi Jinping. But, you know, it's not the final communique that really is the key factor. It's what goes on in some of the bilateral meetings. And I think it's very important that Prime Minister Modi has a chance to speak with President Biden and with all the other leaders, and really shows the increasing worldwide importance of what India does.
You know, but more specifically, can you put your finger on why Xi Jinping chose to absent himself? You said, yes, Mr. Putin wouldn't want to be surrounded by all of his critics, given that even now America is saying that, we soundly condemn Russia's actions, etc. But why Mr. Jinping?
You know, honestly, I don't think there are any good reasons, but I think I suspect that perhaps Putin asked him not to go so that Putin's absence wouldn't be so noticeable. It may be that China is simply trying to downgrade the importance of the G20. I don't think either of them have, in several of the past years, neither Putin nor Xi have attended other G20s. Of course, in 2020, there was no G20. It was a virtual summit because of COVID. But Xi Jinping's attendance, a lack of attendance, may indicate he just doesn't think it's that important. Or perhaps underneath the surface in China, we know the economy's in trouble. Perhaps there are more difficulties that Xi's regime and the Chinese Communist Party are facing, and he's worried that if he left the country, his grasp on power might be weakened.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just quickly have to cut across to Mr. Kishida speaking right now.
With ASEAN to promote cooperation that would lead to synergy between the AOIP and FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, the initiative advocated by Japan. Further, in Jakarta, I announced the new Japan-ASEAN Comprehensive Connectivity Initiative to support ASEAN in strengthening connectivity an area where ASEAN prioritizes. This initiative will allow Japan and ASEAN to work hand in hand to further promote concrete cooperation that materializes essential principles we share, such as openness and transparency. At the G20 summit, As leaders of the world's major economies discussed urgent challenges faced by the global community, such as food security, development, health, and digital, I explained Japan's position and initiatives in such areas. Under the leadership of India as this year's chair, we were able to agree on the G20 Leaders' Declaration, which is a truly meaningful achievement. Japan has been engaged in the negotiations with the intent to pass on the outcome of the G7 to the G20. And we were able to hand over to the G20 points that were confirmed at the Hiroshima summit, such as achievement of net zero through diverse pathways according to the situation of each country, establishment of sustainable and resilient agricultural and food systems, and strengthening the delivery of medical countermeasures, MCM. I look forward to working with other leaders to follow up on the outcomes delivered by the G7 and the G20. On Russia's aggression of Ukraine, throughout the meetings, Japan has pressed for the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops and the realization of just and durable.
Okay, Mr. Bolton, we just heard Fumio Kishida there. Naturally, one of the main issues on Japan's mind right now would be China's aggression. You have said earlier that America and India have very similar concerns vis-a-vis China. The words decoupling or de-risking are often being expressed by many countries with respect to China and its trade practices. But given the sheer scale and magnitude of bilateral trade with China that America has, do you actually see them walking that talk?
Well, I think many companies are making decisions on their own, given the political risk levels that are rising internationally. They're making their own decisions not to put new investment into China, to hedge their bets, to put their supply chains in other countries, or looking for other sources or other markets that they can sell into. The Chinese have let their currency fall. It's now down to a level it hasn't seen in almost 20 years. They're obviously trying to export their way out of the current economic circumstances. I think what the U.S. and India, Japan, Australia, for example, ought to be worried about are places where China is a sole source or the most important source of items that may have defense or military or intelligence gathering capabilities. We want to make sure that in a time of conflict, we're not dependent on a country that may be hostile to our interest. But apart from that, I think the market is doing its own unwinding because companies want to be sure that they've got a more stable place for manufacturing and their supply chain. And I think that's why the countries of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, but also India are really going to be beneficiaries and should be seeking this kind of foreign trade and investment to strengthen their own economies.
So the four countries that you just mentioned, Japan, India, Australia, and the U.S., they're all part of the Quad. But do you believe that the Quad has actually acquired the strategic heft it should have, or it's still a work in progress?
Well, I think it's going in the right direction. I'm very pleased at that, but I still think there's a long way to go. The United States, from its own history, thinks about things like the NATO alliance. I don't think that's where the Quad is at this point. I think we're going to need to see a lot of creativity along China's Indo-Pacific periphery because the nature of the threat is different, and it really is a whole of government threat from China, economic, politically, as well as militarily. But I think drawing closer together, having more strategic talks to see where our interests align, looking more for perhaps joint military maneuvers. I think there was a very significant development a few weeks ago when President Yoon of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan met with President Biden at Camp David, and they agreed we'd have trilateral military cooperation. That's a very significant advance. I think the threat from China is very real in the near term. So just speaking from the U.S. perspective, I think we feel a sense of urgency, and I hope that Prime Minister Modi and President Biden can talk about this and see what additional steps can be taken to help increase security and the conditions for peace in the region.
Now, India follows what it also calls the One China policy. But 3 of our former service chiefs were in Taiwan last month attending a security conference. We also remember how Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August last year. What's the messaging according to you in all of this?
Well, the One China policy is a mantra that I think takes on different definitions depending on where you are. In Beijing, they think that means Taiwan is part of their China. But in the original Shanghai communique that Richard Nixon negotiated with Mao Zedong in 1972, the actual language from it's about China and the United States. It says the United States acknowledges that all people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait believe there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of it. So we didn't actually say we agreed to One China policy. We just acknowledged that. And I think the most significant development since 1972 in Taiwan is that the people there have come to identify themselves as Taiwanese, not Chinese, or Taiwanese Chinese, but certainly not Chinese. And so in the same way that the United States back in colonial times moved away from being Englishmen to being Americans, that's happened on Taiwan too. Taiwan is effectively an independent country.
Now, India and the United States have a divergent view on Russia. India has continued to transact with Russia to secure its energy demands. We've bought Russian oil. Do you believe that these differences will impact any of the attempts at closer cooperation, especially when it comes to getting together and countering China?
Well, obviously, there's a difference of opinion. I wish India would move more in the direction of not purchasing Russian oil and gas, and would see that this unprovoked attack on Ukraine that the Russians carried out in February of last year really is something that the leaders in Beijing are watching very carefully. I think it's one reason why Taiwan is so concerned that the U.S. and the NATO alliance defeat this Russian aggression, because the lesson that Beijing would learn is that unprovoked military action against your neighbors doesn't happen cost-free. And as you and your listeners know, obviously along the line of actual control with China, there's a lot of disputed territory, and the Chinese have been very aggressive over the years in trying to provoke an Indian response. So I think teaching the leaders in both Moscow and Beijing that we have the capability to defeat any unprovoked aggression is a good thing. And what the Russians are doing here is destabilizing in Eastern and Central Europe, and it's not something ultimately that's good for peace and security worldwide.
Now, you've spoken about Chinese expansionism by land and also in the South and East China Sea, but do give us a perspective on the Chinese debt trap diplomacy as well, at a time when India has been seeking to emerge as the voice of the global South.
Well, look, the Chinese have carried out a very sophisticated, very well-planned effort to get more influence in the developing world through the Belt and Road Initiative and through what we call debt diplomacy, to get entice countries into, for example, agreeing to infrastructure projects that they want with what look to be very favorable financial terms at the beginning, but which get more and more onerous as time goes by and which increase Chinese influence. The Chinese have used corruption, bribery, and other illegal steps to try and increase their influence, and it's been really on a worldwide basis. So I think trying to stand up to this debt diplomacy is very important in the developing world. I think the U.S. ought to be doing more to counteract it, frankly.
Okay, finally, Mr. Bolton, what's your view on the G20 grouping itself? Do you expect it to yield any tangible results, or is this more about posturing and power play? Of course, the Delhi Declaration has been hailed across the board, but largely as a grouping. Do you think that it has any real heft? Well,
I've been to my share of G20 meetings, and I would say that the meetings themselves rarely achieve much that's practical. I think the advantage is in the bilateral meetings among the heads of state. And I think Prime Minister Modi has more ambitious objectives for this G20. And they might well have succeeded, but the absence of the top Chinese and Russian leaders makes that much more difficult. Obviously, the China and Russia are represented there by lower-ranking officials, but it's not the same thing. So I wish Prime Minister Modi good luck, but I think he's got a very heavy burden because the Chinese and Russians, in effect, are saying we don't care enough to come.
In your book, Surrender is Not an Option, you had taken a dim view of multilateral institutions like the UN and EU. But how has the world evolved since the time that you wrote that book? Is there a new world order? And where does India fit in this new realigned world order?
Well, I don't think there's much of a world order, to be honest. I mean, people talk about the rules-based international order. Nobody told Vladimir Putin what the rules were before he invaded Ukraine. So I think we're actually now in a new historical era beyond the post-Cold War era. I think we've moved beyond that because of the effective axis that China and Russia are putting together. So I think India's role here is going to be absolutely critical, as now the country with the largest population in the world, a growing, attractive economy. India's international presence is going to grow, and I think its political heft will continue to grow too. So that's one reason it's very important in the context of the Quad or in other international affairs, in my view, for the U.S. and India to work more closely together.
All right, Mr. Bolton, a pleasure as always to speak to you at a time when the entire world is looking at India and actually really wondering what these outcomes mean for the layperson and mean for the next few years. Thanks very much for speaking to us, the former National Security Advisor of the United States, exclusive on Times Now. Quick break.